sustaining the people during this period is important, but it's also important to correct the problem, because this is a man-made problem of extremist owners. That's no way to run a country. So the beauty of CPC is that so I do think that
the coup, what happened in 1953, those are just symptoms of a larger problem, the consequences of a problem. They weren't the problems. Those were just things that were triggered by a number of ethnic and social issues that were happening, and the conflicts that were developing. And they mightn't have happened if we didn't have the kind of colonial history that we had.
So when you look at Nigeria today, you have democracy. We've been practicing the third wave, I believe, since 1999, and it's not getting better by any standard. If you look at today's Nigeria, you have Rivers State in crisis, Osun State almost in crisis. There are problems, insecurity everywhere in the north, east, northwest, southeast. So is Nigeria safer today? Is there more hope in Nigeria today than in January or March? January, let's say go back to January of 1966.
No, Nigeria is not safer today. Even after the war, a couple of months after the war, there was relative calm and safety across Nigeria. What we have today is frustration that has been developing over the years because people feel marginalized, and there is a limit to which people can be deprived the opportunity to live fulfilling lives, which is what has happened. And so people are responding in different ways, including violent ways as well, unfortunately. And you mentioned democracy. Part of the problem is we're not really practicing democracy. And maybe you shouldn't ask people as old as myself, ask younger people. They'll more courageously tell you that we don't have a democracy. Whether you look at our recent elections or look at the way, our systems of governance, they'll say, no, there's no democracy. There is power abuse and dominance. So no, we're not safer. And what you see is the expression of frustration, and it manifests in different ways. Unfortunately, one of those ways is through violence, and unfortunately, innocent people are going to be victims. We're not safer. I lived in Nigeria all through the 60s. When I was going to secondary school, I'd get into a taxi cab, sometimes arrive late at night. It was never an issue. We moved around freely. There were hardly fences between our homes. What separated our homes were maybe flowers or low fences, So we felt safe. We felt secure. It doesn't mean there wasn't crime, but it wasn't anything compared to what you have today.
So on the eve of January 1966, where were you?
January 1966, I was in Lagos. I was a little boy, and we lived in a place called Ann Barracks, A-N. That's where I was, in answer to your question.
What was that? I wanted some more than that, but I know you get it. You got the answer. What was the environment like? I mean, what I mean by that is, what was the mood like? Did you have any sense as a little boy that something was about to happen?
Yes, and it's actually there in my book. I was a little boy, but I also, before 1966, I also remember the sense of camaraderie in our barracks, in the military generally. There was a strong sense of camaraderie, and honestly, ethnicity was hardly a part of our discussion. But 1966, I knew something was wrong. I felt it because human beings have intuition. We're spiritual beings, and even babies, recognize things. So I knew something was wrong because generally there was just this atmosphere of gloom, and my father was out of the house more than he usually was. and people seemed to be whispering a little bit more. I knew that something was wrong, and every once in a while we had military officers visit our home, but for the first time they would come, and they would come with rifles. And even though this was really long ago, these images have stayed with me. So yeah, I knew something was wrong. I felt it, and I think a lot of people felt it, regardless of age.
Now, what about your father and the role he played during that period, especially that coup period?
Yeah, my father was the director of ordnance in the Nigerian army before the coup. He was actually the first indigenous director of ordnance, and his story is that at some point, the second coup, not the first coup was really a disappointment to professional soldiers like him, who were more interested in securing the safety of our people and protecting the land. But when the second coup was being planned, it became an open secret. And at that point, he had been posted to the State House and was the principal staff officer under Ironsi. So he let Ironsi know. Unfortunately, Ironsi now informed people who turned out to be the coup plotters that this is what Effiong had told him. And so my father became a marked man. Unfortunately, he was in Kaduna. He had just been posted to Kaduna before that coup took place. And thanks to friends, the Catholic Church, I think the American consulate, he managed to escape in disguise out of Kaduna and return to Lagos, where he remained in hiding because the coup plotters who knew that he had informed Ironsi about their plot were after him. Yeah.
Mm. And what about you? How did you move around during that period?
Well,
did you move your dad to Kaduna? How was the movement that period?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you when you were asking your question. We hadn't yet relocated to Kaduna. Okay. My father was only there for about a month. So we were still in Arm Barracks, but we had to evacuate Arm Barracks. So it was my mother and some friends who took us out, and we stayed with with the family of another military officer. This man, Colonel Trimnell, from Ishaka, from areas around where my mother is from. His wife was a Yoruba woman, so they had a family home there in Lagos, and they took us in along with their children. They had about 7 children, so we were like 15 children, now not counting house helps, other relatives, and the life just changed overnight. But we were grateful to the Trimnells, because if they hadn't taken us in, who knows what would have happened. But all the time we were there, we couldn't see my father. He was still in Lagos, but he was in hiding, and he managed to eventually escape Lagos to the east. And the man, the Colonel Trimnell himself, everybody from around Ukwani, Ishaka, Ibuza, they were all described as Igbo people. So his life was also in danger. So he was also in hiding as well. But eventually, I don't know how my father did it, but with the help of friends, we were then removed from Lagos to return to the east, to Enugu specifically.
Mm. So the crisis, the second coup happened, and the country went down the drain from that point. So your father, what was he, when he went back to the east, did he become an associate of Ojukwu? How did he now become close to Ojukwu? What was he?
Well, remember that there was an official announcement by Gowon that officers should return to their regions of origin. So what my father did, even though he had to do it in hiding, in disguise, he was actually obeying the directives of Gowon. But when he went to the east, he had served in the military with General Ojukwu, who was the governor then. So he knew him. So naturally, he would connect with the governor and find out what was happening. And there were still disagreements and negotiations and discussions between the eastern region and the rest of Nigeria. And you know about the Aburi and all of that, all of that was ongoing. So for the most part, as a senior officer, my father was a part of a lot of the conversations, a lot of the meetings. The issue of secession had not come up. It came up later. It came up precisely after, not just after the agreements in Abuja were reneged, but after the creation of states. And that is when officially Biafra was created. And my father was not initially the second in command. For instance, he had been the head of the militia. He had served in other positions before he became the second in command.
Okay. So I'm thinking, I'm just trying to put myself in your shoes, a small kid, young person watching the country and knowing, probably, I don't know if you met Aguiyi before he died, knowing that he was killed. What were you thinking about at that time, knowing that your father was in the same profession as this head of state who was killed? What was it? Can you please share with us anything?
It's a good question, because many times people seem to think that young people, children, are disconnected from these things. But no. First of all, let me say I had met Ironsi once. There was when his daughter Angela had a birthday party. I remember attending it, and I remember seeing him, walk in and hug his daughter, and he left us, the children, to just enjoy the birthday party. But in Enugu, when eventually all those things happened and we returned to Enugu and we heard about his murder, it hurt me, because this was Uncle. This was Uncle Ironsi. These people were intimate part of our lives, even though they were grown-ups, they were adults. Because they were my parents' friends, they were also like family to us. So we heard about it, and it was sad. And I knew as a child that there was danger. I just felt this aura of danger everywhere. And then at the time, a lot of people were returning from the north, those who had escaped, and some of them would stop by at my parents' home and tell them stories of the program, of the killings. And those were very, 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 very disturbing stories, because the stories were consistent about people being beheaded, people's eyes being gouged out, people being cut in two, people having their ears slashed, and all women having their wombs ripped open, and their children ripped out of those out of their wombs. So a lot of this was just accumulating in my psyche as a child, and the result was just a feeling of absolute fear and a feeling of insecurity, of nervousness, of anxiety, and that aura, just stayed with us throughout the war and even after. Yeah.
Now, what you are describing is, for those of us who didn't see the war, thinking that, is that different from what we're seeing now with headsmen cutting people, killing people? Is that different? That's what most people might be thinking. It's when you see this, what do you think going on at the present day Nigeria?
It's not the same situation, but it boils down to the same thing. The meaningless destruction of lives for very selfish reasons, or for ethnic reasons, for prejudicial reasons. The people in the East, and most of them were Igbos who were killed, had not had a history of committing crime in the North. They lived in relative peace. There's no history of them committing armed robbery or raping women or burning down the mosques or anything like that. And so what you see happening today, it may not be exactly the same situation, but it boils down to the meaningless destruction of lives for reasons that don't make sense. And these reasons may be ethnically based, or they may be based on religion, whatever they are based on. The fact that they're still happening, and happening without any measures in place to stop them from happening, is disturbing. For me, it's like a continuation of what happened in the past. It's just that it's taken on a new form, a new shape, a new face, whatever you want to call it. But it's part of this history of insecurity, of ethnic bigotry, of hatred, and this history of wanting to get power through any means, especially through aggressive means. I just see that continuing today, even though it may be a different situation.
So let's keep going down. So there were crises, and then your father left Lagos for the east, and they went to Aburi hoping to find peace. Mm-hmm. When that failed, what did you remember?
Well, the Aburi meeting, I didn't know much about it then. I knew about it more later on. The only thing I knew was that a new nation had been created. I was a part of that nation. I was now the citizen no longer of Nigeria, but of Biafra, and that Nigeria was the enemy, and Nigeria was evil, and Nigeria wanted to destroy us, and we had to be prepared to defend ourselves. That was the overriding message. Aburi, I would learn more and read more and study more about Aburi later on. I know that Aburi had something to do with that, but the creation of states as well was a major part of the reason for secession. Secession was never the priority of the Eastern region, contrary to what people may think. I think it was just due to circumstances, and it became what it became, and unfortunately led to the more genocidal attacks rather than reducing the genocidal attacks. Rather than making us more secure, it actually endangered our lives more.
So interesting. Looking at the sequence of things. So at the point when Juku now decided to declare, let me go back to the first coup. This book published by Ibrahim Babangida, a lot of people have talked about it. One of the things that came out of it was this idea he presented in the book that the Igbo coup concept is not what it is, something like that it wasn't an Igbo coup. At that point, when that happened, what was the feeling? What did you understand about the coup plotters and who they were, and what was the general feeling of people who were there at that time?
What Babangida is saying now, did he not know this before? Other leaders on the Nigerian side who called it an Igbo coup and who justified the massacre of Igbos in the north, didn't they know? Are they just knowing? What's the point mentioning this now when you knew it all along, and when people like you could have taken a stand so that Igbos wouldn't have been victimized the way they were victimized? Of course it was not an Igbo coup. If you look at that coup, the major participants, the person whose idea it was Ifajuna. Then he brought in Nzogo, and then Ademoyega, a Yoruba man. Those were the principal leaders of that coup. Nzogo has been, if you don't mind my using, Igborized more than he needs to be Igborized. The man was from Asaba, but was more of a northerner than anything else. In fact, he was such a northerner that people attributed to him a tradition that's common in the north, which is to give you the name of your place of birth. And so he was called Kaduna. And Chinua Achebe mentions him in his book, There Was a Country. Chinua Achebe says that the man could hardly make a sentence in his Asaba language, which is very much like Igbo. But he could speak Hausa like a native. So if you look at these three people, the only real Igbo person there was Ifajuna. And then nobody's talking about the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, the staff sergeants, many of whom were not Igbos. Many are not talking about young officers like Atompera, who later became the governor of Benue Plateau. So Babangida has said that that's good, that's wonderful, except that it is too late, if you don't mind my saying it. I guess it's not too late to correct history, but if people like him and people who, he was a relatively junior officer, but there were top officers who knew that that was not the truth. They could have taken a stand, and it might have gone a long way in preventing a lot of those unnecessary killings. But I assure you that even though Babangida has said this, there's still many people that are still going to tout that coup as an Igbo coup, which is absolute nonsense. Excuse my English or French.
Yeah. So let me go back to killing of Aguirre-C. Did you, at that point, I know that the time had passed, know any details about things like people that killed him and why they killed him? Was it known to people who were around at that time?
Major, what is his name? I'm trying to remember this man. I think it's a common name that's affiliated with his killing. Danjuma.
Danjuma, yeah.
Danjuma has never denied it. Nobody has denied it. He was a major, he wasn't the only one who led that coup. Someone like Murtala Mohammed was a key participant in that coup. I don't know what General Gowon's role was, but for General Gowon to be accepted by the coup plotters and eventually made head of state, he must have at least given them his loyalty. Coup plotters are not going to put people who they don't trust into power after they succeed in their coups. But I would say Danjuma was, as far as going to State House and taking him out of State House, it was Danjuma. And the night that he was taken away, a few hours before, he had actually spoken to my father in Kaduna. Because at this point, there was chaos, turbulence. He had lost his command. My father was trying to escape from Kaduna, but they had one more phone call. And in the phone call, it didn't achieve anything. Ironsi just called to tell him, hey, there are problems. And my father felt like telling him, I told you so. But of course, my father wouldn't do that. So Danjuma has not denied it. Nobody has denied it. So when it comes to the direct killing of Ironsi, he was among the group that went to State House. He was probably the highest ranking officer. So he needs to be held responsible for that. But of course, he wasn't the only one who took part in that coup. In the end, it was just a waste of life. Ironsi had about 7 children. Can you imagine what it meant to those children? And Ironsi had not done anything wrong. He had actually played a key role in ensuring that the first coup was not a success. He played a key role, and all the people who were involved in that coup were in detention at the time, waiting trial. And some would argue that one of his mistakes was to put Northerners in key positions of power. I don't know whether that is true or not, but he wasn't a politician. He was a soldier, and for the most part, he was a gentleman as well. And he just did what he thought he needed to do. But unfortunately, it all worked against him and he lost his life.
Most people who were not there, when they look at it, the history, they say that Ojukwu led the Igbo people to a war that they were sure they would not win. What is your understanding of the sequence of events after the failure of the Aburi Accord and the decision to go to war?
Well, where people want to fault General Ojukwu, they can do that. Where they need to give him credit, they also need to do that. He was in a situation where thousands of his people were being slaughtered and were returning to the region where he was governor. I mean, what was he expected to do? Let's make him an ethic officer, and he was right there in the capital of of whatever the state is, Calabar, and ethnic people are being killed in the thousands and returned to Calabar. What do you expect him to do? To just embrace the new government that has, in one way or the other, been given the audacity to massacre people in the north, the audacity came from that government because that government didn't do anything about it. They didn't step in, So how could you trust this government that had demonstrated that it doesn't value the sacredness of your people's lives? Having said that, he did go on into negotiations, and at Aburi accepted Gowan as the new head of state. So you can't just, we shouldn't ignore the damage done when the parts of the agreement, the federal side reneged on parts of the agreement. Of course, that's going to only cause more concern, more suspicion. And then you go ahead and create new states and basically render Ojukwu as a non-entity at that point. So there's a lot of bitterness, a lot of distrust, and they create this new nation because they don't feel secure in the other nation. But remember that the creation of Biafra was not a declaration of war. Biafra didn't as much as throw a stone at the Nigerian side. So to say that he led people into war when he didn't declare war is really, it sounds really ridiculous to me. War was declared on the Nigerian side. They called it police action, but it was a full-scale war. And I know because I was there and I witnessed it. So no, he didn't lead the people. The people had a right to defend themselves. And for the most part, that's what happened in Biafra, even if we may have made some mistakes in the process.
Now, in your book, you talked about life in Biafra as a kid. Can you, for those who are yet to read the book, and I'm hoping that they will all go and get the book and read after this, can you give us a little idea of how life was in Biafra for you?
Yeah, I was the son of a general who became second in command. So obviously I had access to certain things that many people didn't have access to. Let me just make that very clear. I didn't starve. However, we were all victims. People like to use the word privilege, but I don't use the word privilege. From when we left Lagos, each time we ran away from one community, one town, one city, we lost property. I didn't go to school throughout the war. Occasionally I had some homeschooling. I lost relatives, I lost my grandfather, I lost one of my aunties, I lost my younger cousin. Our entire family compound, what we call compound in Nigeria, it's not just one house. It was completely razed, completely destroyed. And then after the war, of course, we were practically destitute, virtually homeless, and my parents just had to find a way to survive and raise their 7, then 8 children. So life in Biafra, yes, I compared to a lot of people, I was more secure, but I was equally vulnerable in many instances. For instance, when the planes came and bombed, the planes didn't just bomb on certain homes or certain communities. A plane wouldn't come in and say, well, that's General F. Young's house, let's not bomb it. So, I think all of us, to various degrees, were victims, and our lives were devastated. And the psychological, mental effects continue to be felt to this day. I don't wish it on anybody. I don't wish the war experience on anybody.
When your father became Ojukwu's deputy, how did you receive the news? What changed?
It really didn't come as a surprise. I don't know if I remember an instance where my father was declared second in command. I always knew my father was a senior officer because he was among the first generation of military officers in Nigeria. So I'd always seen him as someone who held a key position in the army. So when I eventually knew, maybe it wasn't on the day, but when I eventually knew that it was General Ojukwu's deputy, it really, I don't think I was extra excited or anything like that. I just saw him as still holding a key position in the military.